Okay, welcome everyone to the Denver Interneighborhood Cooperation meeting of the Transportation Committee for March 10th, 2022. We have three great topics tonight. We're pleased to introduce the new DOTI Executive Director, Adam Phipps. Was just confirmed to this position prior to our last meeting. We weren't able to get him at the last minute for our previous meeting, but we've got him here continuing our tradition of bringing in new leaders from DOTI and previously Public Works as they come on, so we can build those relationships between neighborhoods and advocates and the leaders in this very important department. Next, we've got Jonathon and Nica talking about pedestrian dignity, the work that they're doing both online and offline, building advocacy and really succeeding in reaching new sets of advocates and younger advocates. And then we'll hear from Scott Burton. DOTI has an update to the residential parking permit policies. I was able to spend a little bit of time talking with him about that, and it sounds like there's some good changes. So we'll have plenty of time to go in depth. With a couple of years of pandemic behind us, we figured out a pretty good process here for each of our speakers. If you would please propose questions in the chat. And then for all the Q&A time that we have, I'll just pick questions from the chat and ask the person who asked them to deliver them. But that process of proposing questions in the chat seems to work really well. So we'll stick with that. We have a few kind of standard ground rules on the page here, including being polite to ourselves and our guests. And with that, we'll turn it right over to Adam Phipps to give an introduction to himself and what's going on with the department.
Well,
and,
great.
You can share your screen.
Perfect. And you guys will have to bear with me a little bit. Every time I go into presenter mode, my PowerPoint crashes. So we will give this a try. Can you, Joel, can you see the presentation all right?
We are not seeing any sharing yet.
Let's see here.
But you are co-host, so it shouldn't be a permission issue. Oh, there it comes.
All right, can you see that okay now?
We can see that. It's not in presentation mode, but if you like it like that, we can keep it like that.
I will keep it here to preserve us from having to watch me try to reload PowerPoint here. So
right.
Thank you. And Joel, just want to say thank you to the good work that you do here, and appreciate the time that you have allotted to DOTI, not only in today and tonight's discussion, but certainly previous. It's important to us to connect to the community, and it's of course who we serve. Just as you introed here, our intent here is to build a relationship and reduce those barriers to identifying needs throughout the community. So Joel, as you said, my name is Adam Phipps. I am the new executive director for Denver's Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. I come into the role from an internal role within DOTI as our city engineer. Also with me today is Mr. Nicholas Williams, and he is DOTI's chief of staff. We are very fortunate to have him, and he is, of course, available to all of you as you may need. So with that, I'm going to give about a 15-20-minute presentation on some of the new and exciting things that we're doing in DOTI, and then certainly leave some ample time at the end for some good Q&A. I'll move fairly quickly through the slides, and so if you need me to pause or stop back, just let me know. But I want to try to get as much of the exciting information out there as possible. So with that, and let me get here, I want to jump right into our mission statement. And for those of you that have been involved in INC for a while now, you'll notice that this has not changed over the 2019, 2020, 2021 presentations that you received from the department. And that is for DOTI through its employees to enhance the quality of life in Denver by efficiently delivering effective, high quality, safe, and equitable public infrastructure and services. DOTI is a very diverse department. There is a lot that we do. We've got 5 main administrations. The first administration is our project delivery. This is how we deliver capital projects within the city and county of Denver. So whether it is a utility below the roadway, a facility that is city owned, or of course our roadways and our bike network. Everything that we implement in Denver is done through DOTI there. Our second is our mobility operations, and this is how we operate, maintain, and enforce everything within the right of way. Our utility function, which most of you will be familiar with as it relates to our solid waste collection or our sanitary and storm sewer network. And then we also have our office of our chief financial officer, as well as our internal and external affairs, which is led by our esteemed chief of staff, who's here with us tonight. Really, what I want to talk about today is that mobility function, everything that we do in the mobility space. And so when you look at the left side of your screen, what you'll see is those project delivery functions. And when you look at the right side of your screen, what you'll see is those mobility operations and maintenance functions. And we plan, we design, we build, we ultimately deliver. But we also operate, maintain, regulate, and enforce. And so it's not only planning the future and implementing it, but also making sure that we're good stewards of it as well. The graphic at the bottom of the screen here, I'm partial to. I love it. It really speaks to everything that we do in the mobility space in one giant shared street. Talks about the bridges that we operate, maintain, talks about our green infrastructure program, which we've made an 8% improvement of the total acreage in Denver over the last 5 years. And that's a substantial growth in our green infrastructure, something we're very proud of. Or our bike lanes, our street signs, our signals, and of course, our dedicated transit lanes. So too many to go through right now, but if you look at that fun little graphic, it shows you everything that we're about in DOTI. Next, we thoroughly believe that we have to plan well to achieve well. And so everything starts with the mayor's mobility action plan. And it's focused really on 3 core tenets as it relates to mobility. The first is to get to a mode share of 30% of our commuters biking, walking, and taking transit. We've got some work to do, but we have made some strides over the years. 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. And 0 traffic deaths by 2030, which is part of the Vision Zero commitment that we've made. To get there, there's really 4 areas, strategic goals that we've established. I always start with safety because we need a safe network that provides choice, that is a good steward of our climate and our individual health, and is accessible to everyone, regardless of background or means. And that's how we are intending to implement the mayor's mobility action plan. We also want to ensure that we've aligned ourselves with the city as a whole. There's a lot of intricacies. There's multiple departments within the city as we look at how we plan our future. And the Denver Right suite of planning documents is certainly inclusive of what we're doing within our mobility action plan, as well as our strategic alignment specifically in the mobility space. And so this is a good graphic that I think demonstrates a couple of things. One is the hierarchy or the parental nature of Denver Right. And then if you look in the lower right-hand corner here, it shows you where DOTI's role is with that. Of course, we partner with our departments of Parks and Recreation, as well as Community Planning and Development, but we also are very focused on our one community, our one future, our one water approach. And what you'll hear a little bit more about in a future INC meeting, if I'm correct, Joel, Denver Moves Everyone, which is our long-term 30-year planning of what mobility is going to continue to look like in the future. That incorporates Denver Moves bicycles, peds and trails, as well as transit. So this is the all-inclusive vision that we have for Denver as it relates to mobility. In that regard, to Denver Moves Everyone, there's a couple items that I want to really identify that we're working towards. And we're in the midst of this planning effort right now. It will conclude at the end of this year, and we'll roll those documents out early in 2023. First and foremost is you'll see equity, and that's a thread throughout everything that we're doing in our 30-year mobility plan. And I want to pause there for a minute because you hear equity a lot in conversations today, and I want to define that from DOTI's perspective. And that is investing in the person, the places, the things, the assets that need it the most. And that's how we allocate our capital funding, and that's how we're planning our transportation network. We want to ensure safety, mobility, sustainability, community, which I think is a great opportunity for the discussion today, as well as quality. We recognize that we have a unique opportunity of quality of life in Denver that we want to ensure our mobility network continues to maintain. We call it planning the system. How do we ensure that everything works together, that our dedicated transit lanes, that our traffic lanes, our dedicated bike lanes, everything is working in unison to deliver that Vision Zero, zero traffic death future. To do this, we need to not only look at how people move within Denver, but we need to recognize that Denver is an important component to regional transportation trends. So I'm a bit of a data person myself. Love to kind of look at where data has been over time and use that to inform us on how we plan for the future. So this is a graphic that some of you may have seen before, but I think it really reveals a lot, and it tells us what we feel on a daily basis, which is the population in Denver and the metro region has rapidly expanded. What you see here on the blue roadway is vehicle miles, daily vehicle miles traveled. This is a cumulative number. And what you'll see is just between 2013, when we really saw the recovery from the Great Recession, to today, a significant improvement, or increase rather, 15% of growth in that time period. If you go back to 2000, a greater than 30% growth in that cumulative number of miles driven per day. That's a huge expansion for a community, and certainly one that we've all felt as it relates to congestion, as well as we see it in the traffic deaths. The interesting context for this is that when you look at the per capita vehicle miles driven, it's relatively stayed consistent over this same time period. So about 25 miles on that per capita basis. So although individuals aren't traveling more, our cumulative miles traveled has increased significantly, which is really a result of that population growth that we've seen in the Denver metro area. When we start to look at those trends, it's also important for us to understand what of those trips are into Denver, out of Denver, and within Denver. And what you see here is a pretty interesting graphic. And the first kind of takeaway here is that about 1 million trips into Denver on a daily basis, and about the same out of Denver. So really a fairly equal number there. And about 2 million trips within the city itself. And so quite a bit of mobility, not only in and out, but within Denver itself. When we look at that 1.83 million number around the city, it's important to understand where those folks move. And this is one of my favorite graphics because I think it articulates it very well. The larger the bubble, the greater the number of trips. The thicker the line weight on the arrow, the greater number of trips from one area of Denver to another area of Denver. And what you see here is that significant amount of trips within Southwest Denver. That's not a big surprise. It's one of the least dense portions of our city, but you can really see that there is a greater traffic challenge, a greater mobility need, network need as it relates to transit, bikes, pedestrian, all of those movements. A lot is happening in Southwest Denver. It also shows some interesting trends in between districts. You can see some of the commuting patterns that relate to folks that live within Denver that may work at DEN or DIA. But you also see a lot of that movement between Uptown, Lodo, and the downtown district, but really shows a pretty big picture that not only is all of Denver moving, but some interesting trends as it relates to density within the city, which keep this in mind as I get to one of the final slides we have here, because it's an interesting thought that I'll leave you guys all with here. The next thing we want to look at, now that we understand how many trips are happening and where those trips are happening, is what do those trips look like? And what you'll see is our biggest challenge in Denver, and that's what I see as our biggest challenge as the head of the Department of Transportation Infrastructure. And that is 67% of our commuters are single occupancy vehicles. And in order to reach our goals, we need to drastically reduce that number. And that's going to require some culture shift within Denver on how we move about the community. On the right side of your screen, you can see where that breakdown looks like as it relates to walking or bicycle. Transit, carpool, or even a work from home, which is a demographic that we've all, or many of us at least, have experienced over the last few years that we expect to continue to grow here into the future. But you'll notice that fairly equal split amongst those different modes. But at the end of the day, what we really need to focus on is moving folks off of the single occupancy vehicle and into these alternative modes. Again, 30% in these alternative modes is what we're aiming for. And so as you'll see here, we do have some work to do. Next, I want to do some emphasis on our Vision Zero program. It's unacceptable where we're at with traffic deaths today. In fact, it's egregious. 82 people in the city and county of Denver lost their lives on our roadways. That's 82 family members. That's 82 coworkers. That's 82 lives that are 100% avoidable deaths. And that is a significant problem for us. It's a problem that we not only need to address infrastructure changes in our community, but we need to change behavior. And we need to encourage others to operate in a means and manner that encourages and requires safety. You can see our more vulnerable road users share a pretty considerable portion of those deaths. People on bicycles, people walking, that's 27 of those 82. Certainly the most common mode of transport is cars, and you see the majority of the deaths there. But ultimately, this is not good. In fact, it's trending in the wrong direction. This is our greatest number of recorded traffic deaths since we made the Vision Zero pledge. And so as Nick and I and our senior leadership team and all the leaders and employees throughout DOTI look at their day, we start each day challenging ourselves on, are we making sure that we're making a safe network and moving towards that zero death? You'll see in the lower right-hand corner, in 2022, we're just into the second week of March, and we're already at 11, which parallels what we've seen in previous years, which is not good. We need that to trend down, and we need it to trend down quickly. Next, I just want to share some of the excitements that you've seen out on the roadways since DOTI last had the opportunity to present. You see some streetscape safety improvements within the Santa Fe Art District, reducing the number of lanes, reducing the pedestrian crossing distances. This is an area that we had a lot of safety challenges, and we, with some relatively minor work, have made some pretty significant safety improvements. Our bike program, hopefully everyone is familiar with the commitment the mayor made to 125 miles of new bike lanes in 5 years. We just completed year 3, and we're a little bit ahead of that target. We're a little bit over 75 miles. And we're on track to hit that 125. In fact, we're on track to exceed it, something that I'm certainly proud of the team for. But again, we need to make sure we have a connected network to encourage that mode shift. And bikes are an important component of that. Pedestrian crossings. Our goal is to install or upgrade 5 locations per year, whether that's a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, a hawk, or a high intensity activated crosswalk. Anything we can do to increase that safety for our pedestrians crossing the roadway. And we've been successful in implementing that to date as well. There's also some low-hanging fruit. And this is the first challenge that Nick and I always ask our team is, what can we do now? If we're going to get that number down from 82, we need to do major improvements. And some of those are easy. So let's get those out the door. One example is the safety benefits that relate to reflective backplates. I'm hoping many of you have seen some of these small changes that we've made to our signals, 179 of which last year, that decrease crashes by a 15% factor. So if you take 40 of our traffic deaths in 2021 being in cars, if we reduce that by 15%, that's 6 lives that we can save. And this is a relatively easy effort for us. Of course, it's low expense. It does take some person power to make it happen, but 179 intersections, 10% of our total, we've been able to implement just last year, and we're going to continue to ramp that up. Another good success that we've had is our DOTI's micromobility program. And this is a program that we really don't do a good enough job celebrating success on. Our program is one of a kind. We piloted a new program, and Nick will be humble, but this is his baby. He's worked on this for the last few years. And this is an operator-provided free ride to Denver resident program that doesn't cost the city a single dollar. This is 100% provided by our mobility partners. And what you'll see here is in 2021, since that program kicked off, 4 million trips, over 3 million miles traveled. And think about the number of vehicle miles that's reduced, the number of emissions that's reduced, significant usage that we see in our dockless mobility. That's scooters, that's bikes. It's oftentimes it gets associated just with the scooter component of this, but a significant use there that we're certainly proud of this program. And again, this is a zero cost program where not only do we allow the operators to provide the service, but there's also a number of benefits that we require them to provide the community as well. Some again low-hanging fruit improvements that we have on Lincoln. You see some buffering of the lanes between the dedicated transit lane and the traffic way. You see some decreased crossing distances right here on the bottom half of the screen. It looks like it's cut off a little bit, so I'll zoom out there just a bit. But you can see these decreased crossing distances greatly increase safety, and it's some posts, some paint, relatively easy fixes that we can get out in the neighborhoods, every neighborhood immediately. We also want to continue to focus on the campaign as it relates to Vision Zero and the messaging. Make sure we can encourage folks to do things like put their phone down when they're driving. Simple tasks like putting your seatbelt on, in addition to all the infrastructure improvements that we're working through as well. I've got 2 more slides here, Joel, and I'll turn it over, three more rather, and I'll turn it over to questions. But first, I want to remind everyone of the City and County of Denver's equity map and the model that we use for transportation. If anybody has had the opportunity to see this in the past, what you see here is this inverted L, where we really lack in equity. And so this is, as you see, improvements in our roadways, whether it's increased pedestrian and sidewalk access, whether it's increased bike lanes and that network connectivity. 60 to 70% of those investments are in these equity areas in our current capital program. So we're trying to put our money where our greatest need is, just as I had spoken at the beginning of the presentation here tonight. And when we take that one level further and we look at transportation affordability, this is a major barrier to economic freedom, that ability to better one's life. There's their accessibility to transportation, but also the portion of their expense, their monthly expense that accounts for. And what you can see is similar to, but not exactly equivalent to our inverted L, is some transportation affordability challenges that are major challenges. 20 to 21.5% of average household income are spent on transportation in a number of our neighborhoods. And we want to make sure that we're providing access. You see the Montbello connector. This is a first mile, last mile concept, micro transit concept that we launched last year that enables mobility within the Montbello community. And you can see this is one of those areas where that 20 to 21.5% of income is dedicated to transportation, a huge success that we've seen in the community. We've already exceeded the usage per day in the second month of the program launch than we anticipated at the conclusion of the pilot. So clearly a need in the community, and we're looking at replicating that in these other areas where transportation affordability is a real challenge. And then lastly, just want to focus on some of the future efforts in addition to what you've seen. We're also working with our partners in CPD and excise and licensing, as well as a number of other agencies on a permanent shared street program. I'm hoping that many of you had the opportunity to take advantage of that as a result of the pandemic. And we recognize the value that adds to communities and to neighborhoods, and we want to make a permanent process for that. Same goes for outdoor dining. One of the unique things we have in Colorado is the ability to enjoy the outdoors. A permanent solution that allows outdoor dining is in the works. Community transportation networks. Again, how do we ensure that we're connecting communities, but also doing so in a safe manner? Our BRT projects, whether it's Colfax BRT, Colorado BRT, or the federal BRT project we see right here. Dedicated transit lanes and bus stop improvements really improve the dignity at each stop, so that if you are waiting for a bus, you have shelter, you have protection from the elements, and it doesn't feel as if you're doing so in a third world country, which oftentimes it does. And then implementation of our Vision Zero efforts. Again, safety is what we ask ourselves every day, every morning. Are we increasing safety within the city? Microtransit, as I talked about, not just in Montbello, but expanding that in other areas. Denver moves everyone, and our principal planner, Sam Piper, will come in a future cadence here to discuss that in detail. Exciting work. A lot of community outreach happening in April, so certainly can get Joel some information there. But denvermoveseveryone.com. Invite everyone to visit that website and really get involved and participate in the month of April. And then updates to our rules and regs following our complete street guidelines. So we now have a complete street guidelines, which is a big milestone for the department, but we need to codify it in our rules and regs so that we can hold developers accountable to those complete street guidelines. So with that, Joel, I think I took a little bit more time than I intended, so I apologize for that, but happy to engage and take questions at your discretion here.
Certainly, and because we only have 3 topics rather than our customary 4, I think we can go a little longer. I hope you can stay with us another 15 minutes.
Certainly.
And let me just start, because we're welcoming you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your background, and what are your interests? What lens do you come to this with?
Certainly, and happy to do so. So I am a 4th generation Colorado native. My boys are 5th generation, so Colorado is in our blood. I've been in the Denver area for just about 15, almost 20 years now, and they haven't been able to get rid of me ever since. So my background is I'm a professional engineer by trade, went to school here in Colorado, and really have developed most of my career in 2 areas. One is just the delivery of projects, but specifically in program management, and the concept of bringing together multiple complex elements to ensure a quality outcome. I can tell you right now, I'm passionate for safety. I'm hoping that came through in the presentation here today, and not just in our roadways, but also within our department itself. When DOTI is fully staffed, we have 1,500 employees. And it's important to me that we're not only creating a safe environment for them to do their work, but we're really creating a culture within our department, within our city, and extending that to the community of Denver of how do we operate in a safe manner? How do we ensure that that folks aren't losing family members? There's nothing more painful in life than that. And so safety is a passion area of mine. Also, as Nick will attest to, it's important to me that the department recognizes our role to the city, and that is that we're a service entity. And there's a lot of needs in Denver. With that 15% growth that I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of areas that haven't gotten the attention that they need. And so I want to make sure that we have our ears to the ground, that we're in the community, we're in the neighborhoods, and we have that opportunity to affect change, see where the challenges are. A lot of them are small, a lot of them are minor, and a little bit of investment from us can go a long way. So instilling that mentality within the staff at DOTI is what I'm looking to achieve here in my tenure for the remainder of Mayor Hancock's term here.
Okay, let's see how many, welcome, and thanks for that background. I want to see how many questions we can get to. So everyone, if you could be a little bit crisp in asking them. Richard has a question about one-way and two-way streets.
Sure. Yeah, just, the biggest thing that I see is we have a plethora of one-way streets throughout the city. It seems to me the only advantage of a one-way street is to move traffic. I live at 17th and Downing, and so it's 3 lanes going east. It's never full, and the people just scream down the road. Talk about low-hanging fruit. I reached out to DOTI, asked them when that would be considered to be converted to a two-way street, and they said, we're going to wait till the BRT is done, and then we'll consider how traffic patterns work, and then we might think about it. It was just, we're talking at least 10 years down the road to convert any of the streets. I just don't understand that. If safety, climate change, removing vehicles off the road, that we don't even consider that.
And Richard, it's a good point. In fact, I was at 17th and Downing earlier today when I was driving some snow routes to make sure we were getting the coverage that we needed with our plows out there this morning. It's a highway. It's a vehicle highway on both streets, right?
It's just terrifying.
And I can tell you that a conversion from one way to two way is a priority. We're starting in the downtown core, which is why you got an answer that was less than desirable timeline, where we recognize that pedestrian, that bicycle conflict is greatest in the downtown area. We're working out from there. Now, I'll get with the team. We'll get a little bit more clear timeline. They are correct in that we're doing some major changes to the Colfax Avenue as a result of the BRT project. That doesn't have to come at the expense of the neighboring streets. Now, we want to make sure that we continue to have a network that's connected and working, but we can work simultaneously. We have that skill. So, Richard, I'll get that on the list to take a look at, but certainly you're going to see a lot more conversion from one way to two way over the years to come.
Oh, super appreciate that. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks. Jonathon Stahl, so you're asking about pedestrian networks.
Yes. Hello, Adam. Good to meet you on here. Grateful we can connect this way. And just grateful to be here with everyone. So yeah, I think just considering equity and climate and just a lot of the things, and obviously the equity L and, thinking about downtown core investments, but then just very specifically on urban arterials, just to speak to like the specifics of where are the priorities? Where do you see priorities showing up specifically for pedestrian networks, walking accessibility on the urban arterials, just as, as fully connected networks that just honor that dignity component, similar to what you were framing with bus stops?
Yeah, and Jonathon, let me first pause and just say thank you for the work that you do. You bring a lot of attention to areas that need it, and I personally appreciate it. I know the department does as well.
Thank you.
So when it comes to pedestrian mobility, or really mobility in any fashion, there's 2 core tenets in my mind that we need to focus on. One is it needs to go somewhere, right? Mobility is to connect people to places, to things, to resources, but it needs to feel safe, right? You could have a highway from here to wherever you choose, but if you don't feel safe, you're not going to use it. So what I can tell you is safety is our number 1 priority. It's our number 2 priority, and it's our number 3 priority. Now, when we look specifically at pedestrian safety in our arterials, oftentimes in the past, we've missed an opportunity to coordinate with our state partners. And I can tell you that Director Liu with Colorado Department of Transportation and myself are talking on a regular basis on how we tackle challenges just like that. Because oftentimes when you have the level of need that you do in a city the size of Denver, it's easy to put aside those things that require that extra layer of coordination, that extra challenge. And that's something that just isn't acceptable in the department that I'm leading, and doesn't meet our standard. And so you're going to see a huge shift in that than what you've seen over the last 5 to 10 years. You're going to see a lot of CDOT and DOTI cooperation to make sure that those arterials, specifically those that are state highways, get those improvements and get those improvements quickly.
Thank you. So, of course, some of our arterials have some of the most egregious gaps and just sort of goat paths where you can see people have been trying to walk without getting killed for a long time. So,
yeah,
thanks for putting a spotlight on that, Jonathan, and Adam for working with CDOT on that. Rob and several others have talked about bike lanes. Rob, can you tee that up?
Sure. Hi, Director Phipps. Good to see you. I was in the Central Transportation Network stakeholders group last night, and we were talking about some lanes. Particularly, this one is Bruce Randolph, but it happens in a lot of different places. It was described to us that originally there was public support for a protected bike lane. Then as they went through the process, there was some pushback, and now it's going to be a striped lane. When you look at that street, it's one of our old streetcar lines. It's very wide, it's very fast, it's very dangerous. I'm really concerned that we're seeing this a lot. We're seeing protected bike lanes kind of getting watered down. And, the central network is like 2+ years in planning. So let's say we do get something on the street and we want to improve it in the future, is that going to take another 2 to 3 years to get something better? So my real concern is can we do these things properly now instead of later?
It's good questions, Rob, and I'm gonna answer it in 2 ways. First, there's something I take a bit of disagreement with, and not with you, but with the concept that you set out there, which is public support. It's important that we're making improvements to our community that the community wants, but we can't do that at the expense of safety. So that's an opportunity for us as a department to educate the community, make sure everyone is aware and understands those 82 deaths that happened last year and how those deaths occurred and what our improvements are doing to address those. And so when we don't see public support for modifications to our roadways, I believe it's our responsibility to make sure that we're educating folks and they understand why we're doing what we're doing. It's all about that concept of data driving decisions. And so what I don't want to have happen is a bike network that's laid out with a type of facility based on public comments. Certainly want to consider that and hear that. That's not my intent of my statement, but want to be driven by safety. We now have our complete street guidelines, and those tell us exactly what we need to do to increase comfort. And that is our driving metrics. Any age, any skill level, that experience on the bike lane is optimized. Now, there are instances where there are existing uses that won't allow us to do the ideal treatment, and we'll work around that. But want to just emphasize that point, Rob. The second thing is, when we look at our bike network, as I had mentioned earlier, it's just as important on the safety side that we're connecting and we have that complete network. And so, Rob, where there's areas where we might not have the ideal solution in day one, I'm asking the team not to allow that to prevent us from getting a betterment in place today. That doesn't mean it goes off the list. It doesn't mean it's going to be 30 years before it's implemented. For the first time in Denver's history, we have a dedicated transportation revenue source. And that was done with both our adjustments in meter rates that were long past overdue, as well as our increase in enforcement fines as it relates to those behaviors, specifically as it results to safety, parking in a bike lane, blocking a sidewalk, a number of other items there. We now have a dedicated funding source to get these improvements out. And so, Rob, we're looking to try to get a betterment out today, ideal if possible, but where we can't meet that ideal state today, we're going to work with the community, we're going to inform, we're going to educate, and we'll get to that future state of ideal here in our next phases of our bike program.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Can we get just a little more color on how things get sort of downgraded through the process if the community isn't ready? There were years of plans being produced. Denver Moves bikes. The original Denver Moves plan was the Denver Moves bikes plan, and an emphasis on protected bike lanes as the standards for that came into focus. So it's really years into the process that sometimes the downgrading occurs. Do local residents have a veto? Is it city council who says, don't do the protected bike lane in my neighborhood, do a Shero? How does this happen?
It's a good question, Joel, and it's a complex question. And I'll tell you that it's been a challenge, and it's been a bit like a sine wave, if you will, over these last couple of years. The toughest thing for us as a department is that we didn't have our complete street guidelines done until recently. So we didn't have that documentation, that best practice, that guidebook, if you will, to fall back on to say, no, here's why we believe this is the best thing to do, and to be able to demonstrate proven results. And so it's not one individual source or one entity specifically that influences the process. What our objective is, and this is really what you're seeing a shift to in the department now that we have those guidelines, is using those, evaluating the circumstances, gathering the data, understanding the speed, understanding the conflict points, putting out into the community what is the best solution, and then focusing on educating on why that is the solution. We want to make sure that we give everyone a voice and we understand where there are conflicts and working around that, but it's something that we believe we can bring everybody along with us, where in the past we've been a bit reactive because we didn't have those guidelines to fall back on to say, this is why. We don't set protected bike lanes based on a number of trips and a number of speed. I mean, that's exactly how we do it, but we don't do that as an arbitrary number. We do that because we know that's when a minor injury becomes a serious bodily injury, or a serious bodily injury becomes death. And so we have very good reason for why we've established those standards. And we need to, now that we have those, we need to follow through on those. And I think that will add a little bit more consistency to both sides, those that may be in favor of the changes that we make in adding our bike mobility network, and those that are less favorable to it, is that we can show with data why we're doing what we're doing and really justify that safety component of it.
Great. Thank you very much. I do want to note that several people have praised your data visualization about trips. There's a question about them. That slide didn't say commute trips, it just said trips. How do you measure the input of all trips? How do you know what all the trips are? It's a fascinating diagram.
It is a fascinating diagram, and I believe this is the one you're speaking to. There's some survey components that come to this. There's some measurement components that come to it. I could get into the details here, but it's a little bit beyond my technical expertise, I'll be honest. Sam Piper, I asked him that same question, and I know you'll have him, Joel, coming up at in a meeting in the future, so I'll have him walk you through how that data is collected. But it's multiple different sources, and it's a lot of in-depth modeling that for the first time DOTI has in its capability at our own hands, where we're not dependent on just the regional model itself.
Okay, we'll look forward to digging into that with Sam. Amy has a question about mode shift.
Hi, I am a local crossing guard and also the chair of the MBAC, the Mayor's Bike Advisory Committee. I just want to say thank you for taking this job, and also thank you for coming here and talking to us tonight. I really like that you're somebody who gets things done. I noticed on slide 14 that we haven't been able to change the number of single occupancy vehicles that much. And I feel like we know how to do it. We just need more money. So my question is, how much more money do you think DOTI would need to move that needle on mode shift?
Amy, that is a good question. It's a hard question to answer. And I want to first thank you for both your work on the committee as well as the work as a crossing guard. That's not always easy work. So thank you for doing that. Yes, it will take money. There's no doubt about that. But here's the opportunity that we have. As I just mentioned, for the first time in the history of the Department of Transportation Infrastructure in 2022, we have a dedicated funding source. For the first time in many years, the state of Colorado has prioritized transportation funding with the Senate bill from last year, an unprecedented amount with that Main Street focus. And then we have a generational investment with the Infrastructure Act out of DC just recently. unprecedented amount of monies. And it's my expectation, it's my standard within DOTI that we show the federal government, we can demonstrate to the state of Colorado how we can get those dollars spent and spent quickly, which is improvements immediately. And to your point, Amy, safety and reducing that single occupancy vehicle threshold. I think that's the single biggest challenge that we have, is that comfort, that ease, that cultural behavior that folks have fallen into of that single occupancy vehicle. And it's going to take a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of education. It's going to take options. It's going to take all of these things being implemented. But we have a chance to do it. And I wouldn't have been able to tell you guys that last year, because it's an unprecedented amount of money that we have coming towards our transportation networks. And Denver needs to position itself so that we have an opportunity to be successful there. So that's where that focus is, Amy, as opposed to the exact dollar amount. So we want to look at all of those funding sources, the local dollars, the state dollars, the federal dollars, and demonstrate how we can get those improvements out quickly, and and track this data to show how it's moving in the right direction.
So you don't want any more money? You don't want me to ask for any more money?
We love.
I'm just kidding.
We love more money coming into us,
Okay.
but we want to optimize those sources that are out there today.
Thanks.
Nica has a question about pedestrian crossings.
Yeah, thank you. So the question that I had was regarding pedestrian crossings. Have we considered raised crosswalks? And there's actually kind of a broader question that I'd like to ask with this that I didn't include there, but what kind of ADA and accessibility dedicated staff does DOTI have in the planning, implementation, and maintenance process? And also, how are we gathering data that directly addresses accessibility needs?
Nica, great questions there, and I'll tackle those in the order that you gave them to me. First, in regards to raised crosswalks or even speed humps, yes, that's something that you see in our guidelines right now that we're working to update those rules and regs about, or to codify those in our rules and regs. And so you saw that in our immediate action items. So yes, you'll see those in a neighborhood near you very soon. As it relates to ADA accessibility, we have a lot of that expertise in-house that specifically access to those as full-time city employees, but also it's important to us, and we've established some direct contracting opportunities with the private sector and with those industry-known, industry-recognized leaders in the accessibility and ADA space. Nico, one thing you may be familiar with is that we lack standards at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, on what does equity in mobility, independent of means, look like, specifically in ADA. When you look at the ADA Acts from many decades ago, Title I, Title II, Title III, it's silent to a lot of the needs in the community. And so we want to be industry leading here. And so that's accessing those subject matter expertise that are recognized nationwide, and ensuring that they're not only involved in our planning process, as you asked, but also to your last question, that we're considering that in our operation and maintenance. Oftentimes, in one growing pain that you've certainly, or many have felt, relates to our bike lanes. How do we handle snow in our bike lanes? Our climate gets a lot of snow. In fact, this February was in the top 15 snowiest Februaries that we've seen in our history. It's a lot of snow, and it takes a different type of equipment. It takes a different type of phased approach on how we ensure our bikeways are clear. And so as we look at that from a seasonal standpoint, we also look at it from that mobility lens and that ADA lens to make sure that we're achieving that accessibility. That extends to the earlier point that was made in regards to treatment that we do as it relates to bike lanes. The ADA and accessibility is a component that may lead us to shift from what's ideal to something that ensures that we're balancing all the needs. There are areas where we've had to get away from a vertical element to ensure that we are enabling that ADA access. And so the key there is to not only thread it into that planning effort as you identified, but also following it through the entire life cycle and into our operation and maintenance to ensure that it's maintained. And certainly has been a growth area for us, but something that we've really unleashed some of that power and that intelligence and that knowledge base of the private sector just in these last few years.
Awesome.
And we've used probably about as much time as we can in getting to other topics. Sorry we didn't get to every question, I did just want to capture something that Director Phipps said a couple minutes ago in the last question, which was raised crosswalks and speed humps are coming. They're in the Complete Streets Design Guidelines. And when I had the first opportunity to meet with you in your new role, I asked about this, and you told me something about some of the push and pull that we've had in the past with the fire department on this. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you speak fire department?
Yeah, certainly. I'm happy to, Joel. One, and I maybe could have mentioned this at the beginning. One of the unique things is that I spent a significant amount of time. I actually, in fact, recently retired as a volunteer firefighter, as an engineer, as a lieutenant, operating the equipment. In fact, I still hold all of those certifications. And so when we hear those challenges from from the Denver Fire Department, there's a familiarity, there's a comfort that I certainly bring to this role personally, where I can share with them some of the techniques, some of the tools that we used from my previous fire department to manage those. What I can tell you is that at times it's a change, and change is hard. Change is hard for everyone. Change can be hard for me. But educating and understanding and giving that opportunity, putting our planners for ride-alongs with the Denver Fire Department has been a really effective tool for not only our planners to understand the challenges of moving a fire truck within a dense urban environment, but also gives us an opportunity to educate the crews on why we're making those changes and the value that it adds to safety. And when you translate that to a raised crosswalk, eliminating a vehicle versus pedestrian crash, that resonates really well with our first responders. And having that conversation and being able to relate and share that perspective is certainly something that I'll bring to that conversation. And Joel, I appreciate you bringing that up and reminding me of that in our first conversation.
I think it's vitally important that you can play that translating role, because I think the people in our first responder community understanding that the street design leads to the safety, and it's the crashes they don't have to respond to. Most of our fire department dispatches are not for fires; they're for crashes. So thank you for being that translator.
And Joel, just because I have to emphasize this, it is hard. I've seen it as a first responder when you show up on a vehicle, pedestrian injury. That is not something easy to see. And when they recognize that the changes we're putting in place are not to make their job more difficult, but to reduce that call from even happening, it's easy to work in the same direction.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for joining us early in your tenure. And I hope you have this role for a good long time.
Thank you, Joel, and I'm happy to come back anytime you guys would like.
Thank you so much. If I could ask you to stop sharing your screen as we transition to hearing from Jonathon Stalls and Nica Cave. This is on the pedestrian dignity effort. Jonathon Stalls has been active in Denver for quite a while, started Walk to Connect. I was privileged to go on some walks with him. We walked, I think, one time from Golden all the way back to Denver and had some great talks. And recently with Pedestrian Dignity, Nica led a walk just yesterday, seeing the condition of Alameda. A lot of interest in what you're doing on TikTok. So Jonathon and Nica, the time is yours. And if you want me to share anything, just give me the signal.
Right on. Thank you all. Thank you, Joel, for inviting us. Thank you all for being here. I was texting Nica at the beginning, I'm like, we got to get some dance music up in here, move our bodies a little bit. It's just good just to be with you all. So there's so much I could say about pedestrian dignity and the theme. So I'm just going to kind of riff on some general grounding things that we do to organize and invite, and why this campaign. I just want a little bit of an introduction. Thank you, Joel, for what you shared. I really consider myself an artist more than anything. That's my home energy, is to be creative and just in the spaces between. And what's missing in, not only I'm a pen and ink artist as well, and you'll see me at a lot of art markets throughout the city. But so what's missing? How can I draw lines on a canvas, but similar to systems and spaces and built environment? I did a 8.5-month walk across the US in 2010, and that's what grounded me in, wow, across this entire country, the gaps that are living in the bodies of people who walk and use wheelchairs and take transit every day, especially those that have no choice. What they face, what they feel, what they ache with, what they grind through, what they stand in, what they lean on, what they fall over. It just 242 days moving with that. It just made it very loud around just the systemic harm on our most inherent form of transportation, our most home form of getting around, our most vulnerable form. And with that, it was also a very healing journey for me. And it was just a profound teacher to the benefits of moving the way we're made to, the mental health, the social health, the planetary health, connection to the natural world, connection to each other, shoulder to shoulder, next to each other, moving at a pace that's attentive and nurturing, moving with children in a way that they can play and move around, moving at a pace that elders can participate and be a part of community, moving with trees and water systems so we can care for and tend to our trees and our water system, moving with fresh air. I mean, it just goes on and on, the benefits. And so all of this was slamming together as I was experimenting with Walk to Connect for many years as I returned from that walk. And there's a lot to say about that, just alongside a lot of different people and communities and cultures and languages and backgrounds across the city and beyond. And got pretty involved in policy work too, or just advocacy in general alongside. I see Jill on here and Walk Denver and Denver Streets Partnership. We just have always been flowing alongside in creative partnerships. And then through all that, it just got really loud, that just decades that are, and I'm just going to specifically use the arterial streets as an example, just the decades of disregard to these practical, everyday corridors that so many people depend on. There's in some ways outrage. There's quite a bit of outrage, to be real, but there's also just like I wanted to be freed up to just get more creative around how to make invitations and how to collaborate and how to be an artist in this space. So that's a little bit about me. I want to also just pass the mic to Nica just to introduce yourself and anything you want to share, and then I'll go into a little bit more of what Pedestrian Dignity is, how it's blossoming, and what we're experimenting with.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. And yeah, thank you, Joel and Nicholas. And I see Jill in here too. Thank you all for coming out with us yesterday and braving the snow. That was incredible. So yeah, just a little bit about myself. So I am coming from an accessibility lens as a wheelchair user and a Denver resident in the Baker neighborhood. And I got involved with Pedestrian Dignity as sort of a co-organizer and youth outreach, and accessibility kind of expert. So that's a little bit about just where I'm coming from and what I'm looking through, with my lens, and just going on these walk and roll experiences with the city and state, as well as Denver Streets Partnership, has really kind of enriched my understanding of how all of this system and process works and where the disconnect is between these agencies and people like myself, constituents, community members, wheelchair users. So I think my goal through working and learning and growing through all of this is to find a way to more directly connect the youth and the community members to the city and state agencies, because we have this new, powerful tool of social media, which we've been seeing a lot of our youth using as a way to collect data. And, they're sending it to city and state agencies, reporting, these are the areas which we need help. And I just see such a potential, such an opportunity to harness that on the ground, on foot, on a wheelchair, data collection, and really integrate that into the planning process of our pedestrian walkways, crossways, arterials. So just kind of a little bit of my vision for how I see my work evolving, and also just this whole network growing within Denver. And yeah, I'm just, thank you for having me here. and I'll pass it back off to Jonathan.
Yeah, y'all, Nica is on fire. Let me just be real. We leaned in. Thank you, friend, for just sharing. And the walk and roll and transit event that we hosted yesterday, it takes a lot of work, as a lot of you know. And so we're leaning into this invitation of advocacy. And how are we engaging and educating and doing creative outreach with raw, real, everyday community people, our neighbors, our friends, people across the street, people who are out there grinding on Colorado Boulevard. And so how do we encourage some of and connected to what Adam was sharing just around just public education, like how are people getting connected to even just the pathways of reporting and sending things in, knowing that they can, and how do they do it? And so I've been experimenting a lot there using TikTok and Instagram and these other tools. And so that's how Nica flowed in as just a passionate advocate. And in the last couple of weeks, I mean, I can't even tell you how many hours we spent back and forth with draft emails and strategy and audio messages, and just the time it takes, so much of it unpaid, grassroots, raw, out of lived experience, to kind of ache us forward, all of us, our systems, our agencies, each other, to what do we want to see on our streets? How do we want to live? How do we want to survive? How do we want to connect? And so anyway, I just mirror and echo and lift up Nica. She has also taught me a ton, and we learn from each other, and it has been an amazing gift to be alongside her and all of the young leaders that have come through this unique TikTok, Instagram pipeline, now Discord. So I'm curious how many on here use Discord, because I'm 39 and it just is still like, woo, I'm trying. But if y'all are on Discord, please join our network and connect to some of our young people. It's Pedestrian Dignity. So I just want to give a couple frames. And Joel, I don't know, can I share my screen? I just put up a couple photos, actually. Is that possible?
Yeah, I just made you co-host, so please go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to show you all, since we were talking about this event yesterday, this was the winter storm that so the event started yesterday at 3:30, right as it started storming. And we had the city, Colorado Department of Transportation, CDOT, we had City of Denver. So thank you to, just to everybody that showed up. We have Denver Streets Partnership, a lot of their new staff. We had Community Active Living Coalition. We had local advocates, other youth. So similar to what Adam was saying, just connected to he and Shoshana connecting more intentionally between cities and states. That's so much of the goal of hosting these moving events, is to just create an opportunity while we're moving on the very corridors that we're living on, connecting with, to have these 8 different agencies just be in collaborative connection as we move, collaborative co-experiencing of an environment, and then having residents and local voices be just the raw heart of living this every day, or connected to students and families who live this every day. And so these are much more than just, they're not necessarily, I mean, they can have aspects of walking, rolling, transit tour, but I don't like that word, because we're not going in and kind of as voyeurs. We're actually doing it with community. It's a moving experience. And I always like to encourage with these kinds of experiences to sink a little deeper into the heart and into the body, and try not to overthink too much. It's helpful to get strategic, but we want more of us, especially the car driving public, to be in their bodies feeling what this is like. I know because I've walked through it. I know because I've tripped over it. I know because I've waited at the bus when it's 20 minutes late and now I can't get to work on time. I know because I move with and have gotten to know friends, families, others, neighbors who are at the bus stops, who are out there every day. And so just encouraging that our agencies are doing that, with each other. So movement meetings with each other instead of always on virtual, or always, set up your meetings on these arterial streets so you can be in constant proximity to these areas that are really complex spaces to fix, to improve. And so it's just constantly inviting that proximity to each other and to what's raw and real out there. I often describe it as felt knowledge, lived experience, strategy for advocacy. Like, how do we move into our bodies and into relationship with each other, and especially centering people that have no choice but to be out there on foot, on a wheelchair, on a powered scooter, taking transit. And from that vantage point, how are we then shaping and creating systems that serve and benefit all of us? So I just had to show, that's just Nica doing her thing, leading the people. That's CPR news interview, or, capturing some of the audio. This is Phyllis, who is another amazing leader with us, on a powered scooter, just living, doing the thing, and showing literally with her movement all the gaps. I think her scooter stopped and blocked up probably 10, 15 times, making it so we couldn't go all the way to Federal. Just from Broadway to Tejon is what we walked on Alameda. And so again, just a learning environment for so many that had, just moving with, in solidarity and support, open, curious, but also connecting it to actionable change. How do we change this specifically from a dignity perspective? That root dignity framework, like, this is how we're made to move. This is how I move around. This is how I get to the store. This is how I get to work. This is how I have to plan my day. This is how I have to get to school. And how are my systems seeing my experience as legitimate transportation? Like legitimate transportation, not always on the side, always little bits of crumbs, always kind of the last thing considered, always on the whims of private property and development, but like a systemic, just like we have water and sewage, how are we like treating people who walk and use a wheelchair and take the bus as legitimate transportation systems? Like, we got it, just like, how do we get there? And the fact that we're not there is really, and that's not shaming individuals necessarily. That's not daggering, it's just systemic irresponsibility. It's systemic. It's just like, okay, we can go ahead and shift that. Yeah, we're gonna actually bother the folks that have all the choices in the world, and who drive and get a walk for recreation. That's great. Walking for recreation is great. But how are we being systemically responsible to make the transportation experience of millions who can't get into a personal vehicle for all the reasons legitimate? And that's so much of so everything I kind of just riffed on there is how I'm experimenting in storytelling and invitation on TikTok and on Instagram with social media, how I'm experimenting as an artist with hosting experiences with decision makers and leaders and community members as we move through these environments. So it's just trying to just be a little more raw and honest about impact and about harm, but also like hopeful and collaborative and calling each other in. Like, calling each other in, it's not pushing each other further away. It's actually calling us in to a more deeper and open and humble and honest way of being through the world. And so just trying to play a lot there. Joel, I don't know if you want to share the Luxury to Choose TikTok.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, let me share my screen here. If you take
and
yours
please
down.
Jump in on my time too, because I can just go. So feel free to just jump in.
Yeah, let me play this. Haven't done this before, so okay.
Oh, and this one's, oh, there we go.
Detached sidewalk with mature trees and shade and relaxation. And now on a broken sidewalk, butting up to an arterial street. So we're coming from a wealthy neighborhood. This is a class issue. We're coming from a neighborhood where people have tons of unnecessary choices. And this is the reality here, that people who have no choice but to be walking or using a wheelchair, this is what they face. Bus stops, practical trips, grocery, commercial, zoning that has buildings that host services and places that people need to go. So they're thrown on the edge, an attached, hardly sidewalk, sprayed by cars, exhaust, and speed. It's violent.
So that's the raw reel you're talking about.
Yeah, it's so, and I can, here, let me, I think I can unshare here. Oh, you're sharing now, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'll take it down.
Yeah. So how I'm just, and honestly, y'all, this is truly just experimenting. I made a very intentional decision a couple of years ago to just be like, I'm tired of filtering the harm. I'm tired of it. And so I'm just going to start experimenting in a way, but always with an open-ended, a calling in, how do we do this together? An approach related to that. So storytelling, being very specific, and you saw how quick that video was. It was less than a minute. Most of the TikTok videos are less than a minute. And so there's, they can kind of fit in and they fall into a lot of different spaces wherever people are on TikTok. What's interesting about TikTok I could spend a whole nother segment on TikTok, but just a quick thing is our TikTok has localized organic reach. So if I'm doing a live video, so now there's roughly 100,000 followers on the TikTok account for Pedestrian Dignity. So if I'm moving live on Colorado Boulevard, which that video is on Colorado Boulevard near 17th. So if I'm moving on Colorado Boulevard and I'm live on TikTok, TikTok will literally bring in people. So it's a little bit creepy. It's a little bit like, oh, this may not be okay, depending on your situation. But for the purposes of what I'm trying to do, it's incredible because as I'm moving through live, I could have 200 to 500 people moving with me on this walk. And the TikTok is constantly bringing in local people. Now, knowing the age range of folks who used to, again, y'all, I'm 39. Someone invited me to TikTok who was about 13. I'm like, great, thank you, great idea. I can barely handle Instagram and Facebook, but no thanks, but great. And I sat on the bus a year and a half. This was a year and a half ago. I was hosting a walk experience on the West Side. And I sat on that bus and I just was like, I was just invited to engage by someone who was 14. Like I was just invited to engage with someone who is 14 related to something that connects the younger generation to civics, their streets, their dignity, the aches, the thing. She's like, you got to get on TikTok with these messages. I'm like, ooh, I don't even know what that means. And I sat with that and I'm like, I'm going to lean in. And I started experimenting with that. And it's been the engagement, y'all, has been incredible. Hundreds and hundreds of that. I can't even track it anymore. And so I was just saying earlier, like the live. So I'm grounding us a little bit in just the rawness of going live. It's not pre-planned. It's not like I have a script every time. I'm literally commuting to my destination, but I'm tracking intentional dialogue and education around how our built environments either support or don't support people who walk and use a wheelchair. I'm able-bodied, so I have limited frameworks for that, but I try to document and educate as I move. And there are a number of people who are joining, like hundreds, like, dude, you just walked by my house. Whoa, I can see you from the apartment. And so they're coming into this fold organically, and they have all kinds of questions. A lot of, this is what I experienced in school when I didn't, a lot of people who are super supportive and want to get involved because this is their lived experience and they've had to be the one riding the bus every day to school. So the age range roughly, it's like maybe 18 to mid-late 20s. And it's thousands of brand new, not new, I live this, I feel this every day, but new to like, how do I connect now? How do I start reporting these things with you, with us? How do I start engaging in, how do I start learning how to connect to my city council member? What do they even do? Who are they? How do I start connecting to state representative? What is a transportation system? What does DOTI mean? what is, just these, and it turns into this amazing dialogue that becomes a 20-30 minute advocacy education experiment classroom as we move. So anyway, I could go on and on. Joel, did you raise your, yep.
Yeah. Let's just kind of bring it towards some questions here. But
Please.
First, I just want to acknowledge the power in what you do, both on TikTok and on these walks. On these walks, you're taking the leaders of DOTI, the leaders of CDOT. I mean, you know, the second in command at CDOT has joined you for the past 3 walks. The new leader for Region 1, which is this area of CDOT, was on the walk yesterday. But then the TikTok, which reaches so many thousands of people, is also raw, real. You are there undeniably showing what sucks and occasionally showing what's great as well. So that's really, really powerful. And you've used the technology in a way that it's a low barrier to entry. You're not going back and editing videos and, you know, writing white papers to post them. You're just putting it directly out there. And that leads into Amy's question. Amy?
Well, this is actually Lauren's question that he chatted to me before he left. What's the process like of creating a TikTok video? Do you put a lot of planning into it? And then second, what can we do to assist you or support you?
Love it. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, so honestly, it's extremely easy. And what I really appreciate, well, okay, I say easy very loosely. I need to back that up. It's not, depending on your comfort level with the smartphone, using a camera, taking a video. I mean, there are things that make the video editing process easy. It does take time to kind of figure out how TikTok works. But I would just say from a very basic, like, how do you create, I mean, just a vertical video. So you want your videos to be vertical. You want them to be under a minute. I would just say, especially now, under 30 seconds, maybe even less. So it forces you to really condense your message and get clear about, like, what message are you grabbing their attention with? What's the hook? And then what's the call to action to get them to engage, like it, comment, ask questions, and go deeper. So, and then I would say in between, so let's say we're talking about a 30-second video, every 5, 7, 10 seconds, maybe being mindful of how could I do a quick transition? How could I have multiple small clips to keep the attention, like to maximize attention span? So there's all those little tricks you can do, but just generally speaking, if you're out in your community and you are curious about what sharing this on TikTok, if you use Instagram Reels is very similar. It's meant to flow there. There's YouTube Shorts now. TikTok is growing. I don't even know the numbers, but it's becoming one of the most popular platforms now. And there's all the other platforms that are now adapting to these kind of micro vertical videos as a way of storytelling, and specifically for advocacy and organizing. So I just encourage you, vertical video, less than 30 seconds. And if you're kind of nervous about starting your own or figuring out if you see gaps and barriers where you are in your community, so this links to the how can we help, please share them with me. Share them on your reels, tag Pedestrian Dignity as a way of like, okay, this, and then I'm always resharing in the stories on Instagram. So having all of you just engage in that way is great. If you join our Discord community with a lot of our young people, sharing the videos on there would be great, even if you don't want to share it on your own profiles. And I also have a video submission form that is connected to the link tree. That it's a link underneath my profile on Instagram and on TikTok. And there's a submission form that I could send to Joel. I can follow that up in an email if you're doing a follow-up, and just, you can send your video in that way. And then I can kind of chop down some of the editing and do it that way. But so that's connected to the social media, how to help. But one of the things that I'll just connect to how can we help. It's honestly, y'all, like the thing that is always the loudest for me, especially for the car driving public, is start replacing your trips. Like, start replacing your trips and reorienting your relationship to time to be in solidarity with the people, and specifically walking and using the bus. So that like biking is great. I'm all about biking, but there's an entire other universe when you are moving at a 1 to 3 mile per hour pace. You are in solidarity with the people who are moving without a choice. Elders, grandmothers holding bags of groceries on the edge of Leedsdale on a sloped ice. If they slip once, they will not survive. And so if you start replacing your trips, it doesn't need to be all of them, but just commit to a week, a day, If we all organized a campaign like Seattle to get our city council members to commit to replacing their transportation trips by other modes for a week, I think that's a specific opportunity that we can use as a model. But if we're doing it ourselves, we'll have more experience to bring that into how we can organize our officials to do that. To me, that is one of the most, you will learn so much in that week if you replace half, all, part of your trips by foot or just by transit, replacing both automobile and bike with this frame, and then to document what you experience. And that's exactly what I'm doing with pedestrian dignity. If I feel unsafe, I might create a video and be like, this is bullshit. I'm unsafe. Do you all hear the traffic? Do y'all hear how violent this is and how much exhaust and every day, all night? Imagine storms, nighttime, children, families. This is horrible. How can we change this? What do we need to do? And sending that, just that raw video, then following up, sending it to the city council members, sending it to the transportation staff, tagging Denver DOTI, and just, some of those raw, just this is the lived reality. It's not throwing daggers and saying, but it's just saying this is real out here.
Can we hear a little bit from Nica? She's putting some great stuff in the chat.
Yes.
And then we'll need to transition.
Okay.
Nica, you've got some great thoughts you're sharing with everyone in chat. Let's get it on the video as well.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add a little bit of just kind of like the reach, with this whole online space. There's kind of this other side to it. Some things I'm mentioning here in the chat are, especially with the Discord, this is currently serving as a way to disseminate resources and education to the public in a way that most people don't know how to access. And so I think that's really powerful. And as well, these spaces are also serving as a place to create and organize other micro networks throughout the US. We've seen some already popping up in Omaha, South Florida, Boulder, everywhere. So it's really exciting. And I think there's just so much potential with utilizing these social media networks and online spaces to create a much more direct access to our city and state officials for the public. So yeah, just things that I'm saying in the chat, but just
thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. One of the things that neighborhood organizations struggle with, and we're really honest with ourselves that we struggle with it, almost all neighborhood organizations, is how to get the next generations involved in it. And it may not be through the same sit down monthly meeting neighborhood organization. We need to look at what you're doing that is succeeding, and have the communications in a way that is very visual. It is very advocacy oriented, because we're all trying to make our cities better. I'm just going to share one more thing as we transition here, and that is we are extra lucky to have Jonathon tonight, because he is taking an hour away from working on the final draft of his book. And Jonathon, just a couple sentences on this.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. Yeah, I'm just really excited, y'all. So much of this work is practice-based for me, like just to be in a practice relationship to moving the way we're made to. So all the benefits and the challenges, but very much the benefits of moving the way we're made to as a way of advocating for our streets to shift to center the pedestrian. So Walk, this is a book with North Atlantic Books and Penguin Random House that's coming out in August. So I just invite you, it's August 16th is the release date. So if you're curious about as an artist, it's practices, stories, a lot of my little drawings, and just some frameworks and references on so many benefits and invitations related to moving this way. So in urban, rural, nature, and relational spaces. So thank you, Joel.
Thank you. And although it's coming out in August, your draft is due what, tomorrow? Tomorrow. Thanks so much for spending your evening with us and for all the work you're succeeding at here. There's links in the chat to your Discord. There's links to the TikTok, and you can just search on Google for TikTok, TIKTOK, and Pedestrian Dignity, all one word.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Thanks, Joel.
We'll transition to our final topic here tonight. Scott Burton and team, he's supported tonight, are working on revising the residential parking permit process. And I had a chance to use more of Scott's time than I thought he was, I'm sure thought he was getting into in preparing for this, going over his slides and asking my questions. And I think there's a lot of kind of truly sharing this limited resource that they're trying to share more fairly in this effort. So I'm pleased to present Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. Good evening, everyone. As Joel mentioned, my name is Scott Burton. So I'm a transportation planner with DOTI, specifically with the Curbside and Parking Group, which is within transportation operations, if you're interested. And joining me this evening is our manager, Alyssa Alt, who I think presented to you all back in January or February, I'm not sure, but she's here with us as well. And as Joel mentioned, we've been working on an update to our residential parking permit program. We kicked this off about a year ago, and we are here to give you all an overview of our recommendations and next steps.
Okay, Scott, you are a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Perfect. All right, I'll go ahead and get started then. So we'll hop into the agenda real quickly. I know we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time, but thanks again for having us. I see a lot of familiar names and faces. It's good to be here. So as I mentioned, I'll give you a little bit of an update on what we've accomplished to date. So we've been working on this for about the last year, give or take, and just tell you a little bit about what we've done, what we've accomplished. Give you a quick overview of the current residential parking permit program for those that are not familiar with it, and then really concentrate on providing an overview of the recommendations. What are the more critical, more interesting recommendations that'll come out of this update, discuss next steps, and then leave time at the end for questions. So in terms of our timeline, as I mentioned, we kicked off last January with several rounds of city council briefings. We also assembled a stakeholder working group, which is roughly 25 people representing every council district within the city. So this group we've met with 4 times. They've been really helpful in helping us refine our recommendations and get to where we are today. So we can't thank them enough. We've met with a lot of internal organizations as well. Those include, Community Planning and Development, Department of Housing Stability, Denver Housing Authority, the City Attorney's Office, the Office of Social Equity and Innovation. And then we've had 2 rounds of meetings with City Council. We'll have a 3rd in April. In late last year in December, we developed an online survey, a targeted survey for those that are currently part of the residential parking permit program. We sent that to roughly 10,000 people. We received, it was a 42 response rate. So very happy. We got a lot of great feedback that we've been incorporating and sort of confirming our recommendations and helping us refine those as well. And then today, here I am presenting to you all, and then we'll continue to refine our rules and regulations and get that draft together. At some point, likely in April, we'll be presenting to the PRC. So that's the Policy Review Committee, which is run out of the mayor's office. And then a public hearing will be held likely in June. So in terms of our current residential parking permit program, for those that don't know, in case you're curious, the ordinance was written in 1956. It's modified in 1987, but it has not really been updated since then. So that's going on 30 something years. It's been a long time, and we've been wanting to take a look at this and revise this policy for a while, and I'm glad we finally got around to it. The initial focus of this program really was about protecting residents from folks coming to their neighborhood to attend a Broncos game or to go to a farmer's market or a restaurant or a bar or what have you. And it was really about protecting. It wasn't about maximizing that resource and using the curb lane efficiently. It was really, let's keep people out of here. And so that was the original intention, and that certainly isn't in line with our current city goals from a transportation or land use perspective. But it's really, inclusion in the current program is based on dwelling type, building size, historical context, whether those buildings have or do not have off-street parking, what was the intention that they park on street, And then looking at parking occupancy and patterns and where people are coming from and how long they're parked, and just really evaluating the area to truly understand the curbside and parking challenges facing a certain area. Roughly 30,000 permits are issued annually across 26 districts, so it's a relatively small program. There are two types of restrictions. So the one that I think most people are familiar with is when it says something like no parking, permits accepted. So there's parking is not allowed unless you have a permit. But the more common one is when you have time limits in residential areas, and then patrons, employees, customers, they have to abide by the 2-hour time limit. But if you have a permit, then you're not subject to that time limit and you're exempt. And so that's the more common. We also have two types that we refer to: block permits and area permits. So a block permit is only valid on the block that you reside on. And area permits are not as common. We have them in a portion of Capitol Hill, the Baker neighborhood, and Berkeley Park, and soon to be in the Cole neighborhood. But that just allows you to park on any block within the designated area. So it essentially increases the number of blocks that your permit is valid on. You're still subject to street sweeping and 72-hour restrictions, so nothing really changes there. And in general, businesses, mixed-use properties, and large apartment or condominium buildings are ineligible. And their permits are currently free, although as you'll see shortly, we are proposing to change that. So put this graphic together to illustrate where most of our permitted areas are. So those are the black blocks that you see. And as you can see, it really does not impact that many streets. So roughly 4% of Denver streets are currently permitted in some form, and it impacts roughly 5% of Denver residents 16 years or older. So it's a relatively small program, even though it's going to grow to some extent when we expand eligibility once this rules and regs is approved. It's also becoming smaller in certain areas as well. So for example, we just removed all of this permitted parking near Johnson and Wales University. And so it's increasing and decreasing, but it'll always be a relatively small program. A little bit about why these rules and regulations are needed and why this effort was a priority for the city. So some of the 4 things that we really wanted to focus on: equity, highest and best use, replicable process, and changing cities. So we want to make sure that we can be more equitable with this program by expanding eligibility, by creating and implementing permit maximums that we'll get into shortly. And then when we talk about highest and best use, you'll probably hear that term again tonight. We really just want to make sure that we're maximizing our resources. It's not about protecting the neighborhood and keeping people out. It's about utilizing that resource and providing resident access. But we want to make sure also that this policy can respond to shifting curbside priorities, emerging transportation. We want to make sure that it's a transparent and consistent program. There's not a lot of information online currently about our program, so to some people it's a mystery. For example, if you buy in a condominium, an apartment, or lease an apartment building, or sorry, not a building, but a unit, an address, you might hear from your realtor or landlord that you're eligible to get a permit. Then you move in and you realize that you're not. And that does happen from time to time. So we just want to be more transparent with their information so that people know if their address is eligible for a permit, and if it is, how many permits can they obtain. And then the city's changing, as you all know, so we want to make sure that this responds to rezonings, TOD, mobility goals, transportation priorities, and increasing densities is a priority as well. So when we met with our stakeholder working group last winter and early spring, we developed a variety of different goals and objectives, but there was a lot of overlap between those goals and objectives. So we turned those into what we're referring to as these core values, these 6 things that have really influenced the recommendations that you'll see today. So create a transparent and efficient program, apply equitable program application, consistent eligibility criteria, neighborhood-based decision-making. So even though eligibility criteria might be consistent throughout the city, the parking strategies that would be implemented and introduced to a neighborhood are unique based on the land uses, the priorities for that neighborhood, and other things. And then again, there's that word maximizing curbside resources. Let's just make sure that we're being efficient, and most importantly, want to make sure that we're supporting DOTI transportation goals and objectives. So these guiding planning documents also that you're likely familiar with, these have really influenced the recommendations that you'll see today. So we wanted to make sure that what we were doing is consistent and referenced in a lot of cases, Blueprint Denver, a strategic parking plan from 2010 that we're going to be updating this year to make it more action and implementation oriented. Denver's mobility action plan, and then of course the TDM program rules and regulations that were passed last year. So we just want to make sure that we're being consistent with these. So these recommendations here, we're referring to these as easy wins. Some of these are things that we are already doing, but we just want to make them a formal part of the program, a formal part of the process. So we want to look for opportunities to streamline the permit application process, reduce barriers, make it easier for people to apply. As I mentioned earlier, we want to provide an address and permit eligibility database and make it publicly available so that folks know if they are eligible, and if they are, how many permits are they eligible to obtain. We want to emphasize that we would establish new permit zones and management practices through the Curbside Access Plan program. Some of you may know that name, that program by its previous name, which was the Area Management Plan program, then the Curbside Access Management Plan program. The process is the same, even though the names have changed. And then we want to emphasize area permits. So those are the ones that allow folks to park on any block within a designated area and really move away from the block permits that are so common throughout the city. And then establish what we're referring to as the Flex Parking Permit Program, which will replace the current Guest Parking Permit Program. So some of the more impactful changes include expanding permit eligibility, applying permit maximums. Those will be based on off-street parking availability. I've got a slide that has more detail. We want to emphasize that we really need to, or the importance of balancing curbside management strategies in a given neighborhood or area to make sure that we're accommodating all users through that balance. And then evaluate parking permit zone effectiveness. If we're going to charge you for a permit in the future, which is what we're proposing to do, then we want to make sure that that permit, that the program in that neighborhood has value, that it helps you find a space, and then also that it can be enforced as well. And then, like I mentioned earlier, proposing to establish parking permit fees. So expanding permit eligibility. So what we've been, and these have evolved a little bit over the last couple months, but right now, if it's a block rule, we're proposing to allow buildings with up to 20 units or addresses to be eligible. Currently, it's roughly around 9 units. So if the building is less than 9 units, it's ineligible. If it's more than 9, it would not be eligible. Sorry, if it's less than 9, eligible, more than 9, ineligible. And that hasn't been applied consistently throughout the city for several decades, but that's something that we're going to just make sure that we're applying this policy and these recommendations consistently throughout the city. If there's an area permit present, then the assumption is that that area can absorb more parking demand. So therefore, we could allow larger buildings to be eligible for the program. And then buildings, developments, and addresses that have received off-street parking exemptions or reductions would not be eligible for the parking permit program. And I say likely not because it depends on the intention of those exemptions. For example, if it's related to an affordable housing project in a relatively low density area, then perhaps those addresses would be eligible. But if it's oriented towards density or TOD, then our recommendation would be that they not be eligible. In addition to that, it's unlikely that a permit program would be eligible in that area in general. And I can get into that here in a second. Getting into permit maximums in a little more detail. Like I mentioned, it's based on off-street parking availability. So if you have off-street parking available, you'd be eligible for 2 vehicle-specific permits or 1 vehicle-specific permit and a flex permit. So a maximum of 2 permits per address if you have off-street parking available. If you do not have off-street parking, you'd be eligible for 3 vehicle-specific permits or 2 vehicle-specific permits and that flex permit, which, like I mentioned earlier, is replacing the guest permit program. And we're defining off-street parking availability as a driveway, garage, whether it's used for that purpose or not, a carport, alley access, or an apartment or condominium building with off-street parking, paid or unpaid. So when we say we want to balance curbside management strategies, we've been doing this for several years now, and some neighborhoods have scenarios where you have restrictions in every direction. So let's say you have your commercial corridor, take any of the embedded commercial areas within Denver, say South Pearl Street in Platt Park, or Tennyson Street in Berkeley Park, 32nd Avenue and West Highland neighborhood. And you have these permitted conditions or these time limits that exist several blocks in every direction, but that makes it really difficult for residents to have guests over. They only have one guest parking permit. So if they only have one guest, that works out well. But if they have more than that, oftentimes their guests have to park, 4 or 5, sometimes 6 blocks away. So by providing more balance, what we mean by that is providing more unrestricted parking, providing more loading, more short-term parking, just really looking at the uses in that area and making sure that we can accommodate all the users. And unrestricted parking is one of the best strategies to accomplish that goal. Evaluating RPP zone effectiveness. So like I mentioned, if we're going to charge you for a permit, we want to make sure it has value. So we want to make sure that it helps you find a space. So in dense neighborhoods, the permit program may not be effective if the number of permitted residents significantly exceeds the available parking supply. So if you have, let's say you have 300 permitted spaces for 100 on-street parking spaces, then the number of permits exceeds supply pretty consistently, and then it's not going to help you find parking. So why do we certainly don't want you to have to apply for it, to pay for it. It's just let's revise the strategy in that area. That's potentially remove the parking permit program. We can still leave some time limited parking and strategic locations for guests. We could put in some loading zones for Amazon, FedEx, and Uber. And then so we'd be proposing to apply this to all the current zones. Like I mentioned, we want to make sure that these regulations, that these recommendations are applied to all neighborhoods consistently. So we would at some point reevaluate all the existing permitted areas as well and make changes through the curbside access plan program, which is just a comprehensive neighborhood parking plan process that some of you may be familiar with. It's roughly a 9 to 12 month process. It really relies heavily on a stakeholder committee that we assemble when we get started. That's made up of businesses, residents, representatives from the registered neighborhood organization, business improvement districts, business owners, just people that are very familiar with the neighborhood. So we then have that committee help us develop a draft plan. Part of that process includes, obviously, we want to collect data. We want to know what the parking challenges are, establish goals, and then develop recommendations and then implement. So roughly from the time we kick off and initiate to implement, that's roughly 9 to 12 months. And like I mentioned, extensive stakeholder and resident engagement. And so very unique, the outcomes are very unique. So for example, the strategies and the types of time limits or permitted conditions that we implement in, let's say, Berkeley Park are oftentimes very different from what we've implemented in, let's say, Platt Park, for example. It's just the goals for the business improvement districts or residents, they're different. So we have a very unique approach, and we've implemented a variety of different restrictions through this planning process. In terms of permit fees, we're only proposing that the fees cover the costs of administering the program. So it's not market-based. That's not what we're proposing. Currently, we spend about $1.1 million a year administering the program, and we just run a recover costs. And we're also exploring a free or discounted permit option. This aspect of this recommendation will likely be evolving between now and when this is approved in June. For more information on the permit fees, we're proposing roughly $35 that would be an annual fee. So it's not monthly, it's annual. It's in line with some other peer cities and some other cities where we've done a lot of peer research and just RPP, residential parking permit research in the past. So we feel like we're in line with several of our peers in terms of cost. In terms of next steps, as I mentioned, at some point, likely in April, we'll be presenting this information to the Policy Review Committee. And then the rules and regulations will be reviewed by our stakeholder working group this spring. We're going to update City Council in April or May. Also going to be making some significant updates to our project website. and doing some targeted outreach, providing materials to registered neighborhood organizations, business improvement districts, and other stakeholders throughout the city so that they're well aware of what the recommendations that are included in this policy update. And then there will be a public hearing that's a part of this formal process. A public hearing is required to approve any rules and regulations. And then implementation would likely not begin until 2023, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't start applying these rules and regulations and these recommendations through the Curbside Access Plan program between summer and the end of the year. So we'll be looking to implement certain aspects of these this year with more robust implementation beginning next year. And I know that was a lot of information in a short period of time. I went through it pretty quickly. I wanted to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions.
Okay, I'm going to call in some questions that were proposed in the chat to start with, and we'll see where we go from there. Steve Hartley asked some questions about what was and wasn't included in the mapped areas. I know Alyssa chimed in, but Scott, on the map, which is a very compelling map, I think you and I spent some time looking at it. Some places like Baker don't seem to be as filled in as one would imagine around the DU area. What isn't included here?
Yeah, so the DU area should pop out a little bit more than it does here. I'm not sure. We updated this graphic a couple of days ago to reflect the new DOTI equity index, and it could be that something happened with that neighborhood. But yeah, there's a lot more in the DU area, and then Baker is certainly more prominent than it looks on this graphic. But for the most part, I think this gives a pretty good idea of where permitted areas are. I mean, you can clearly see we have Regis here. Here's this, stadium area. We have some of Lower Highlands in this area, is the West Highland neighborhood, Capitol Hill, Cherry Creek, Golden Triangle, Lincoln Park, 5 Points. Yeah, we will be improving this map between now and doing more outreach. So good point.
Loretta has a question about the visitor permits, how they work now and in the future. Loretta.
I think that was answered. Thank you.
I was answered in the chat. Do we want to, Alyssa or Scott, do we want to kind of put it on the recording for people who might watch later? How do visitor permits work now, and what's the essence of the change for the future, especially around contractors and other infrequent visitors?
Yep, that's a great question. So through the survey results, it was clear that people would like the ability to register a work vehicle at their home. So if you're assigned a work vehicle that you bring home, Monday through Friday, it would be nice for you to be able to park that at your home. You currently cannot do that. It needs to be registered at your address. So in the future, you'd be able to use the flex permit for that. Additionally, we've heard that if you're having work done at your home, if you're having a plumber come or a fence contractor or what have you, that they're technically an employee, and so they're not supposed to use that permit. Or if it's a childcare provider, that's an employee also providing a service. They can't use the current guest permit, but they could use the flex permit in the future. So it's more flexible, as the name implies.
Okay, Chris Miller had a question regarding terms that you used, highest and best use. So we're talking about a limited resource on the curb lane. Chris, do you want to add color to your question?
Certainly. A few slides near the end, there was a statement that there was like this is all going to be focusing on the highest and best use, and that's very conditional. And my first question was, when does the highest and best use ever include protected bike lanes or dedicated bus lanes? And then Alyssa responded in the chat that highest and best use is talking about the curb lane after bike, pedestrian, and transit uses, which leads to a follow-up question of, does this mean that DOTI is going to actually prioritize protected bike lane and bus infrastructure over parking?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the neighborhood and the location and the corridor. I think it's a complicated answer that it depends to some extent just on the corridor and the location and the parking demand and what the land uses are. But I always like to say that we're not necessarily our group in the parking preservation business necessarily. Like we want to make sure we're supportive of other DOTI transportation goals around transit lanes and bike lanes. So if the decision is made that that lane is best used for parking, then let's make sure we maximize it at that point.
And one thing I want to add to that too is just that one thing that people often forget about when we're talking about parking and curb access is loading, and the amount of loading that's happening and continues to happen throughout our city due to Amazon, Ubers, Lyfts, deliveries of all sorts and kinds, and things that are coming to and from people's homes and businesses and things. So we want to just make sure that we're providing space for all of that, so that we're not creating a spot where we put in a really amazing bike lane and then people are just blocking it because they don't have a place to do those other necessary things that are happening in our city organically or on purpose. So just wanted to point.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa.
Yeah, shared, we carve out places on the curb lane for bus stops, right? And when we say this is a priority, the bus has to be able to load and unload people, and we together have prioritized that for some number of feet, and loading and unloading, whether it's ride share or whether it's deliveries, makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like that's going to be part of the CAP. This new style area management plan as you're coming through is intentionally carving out spaces for that, because that's sort of the most shared in some sense because of the high turnover.
Right. And another thing we're hoping to do with the update to our strategic parking plan. So as I mentioned, it's going to be a curbside action plan, and that'll be a priority for us for the rest of this year and then into 2023 as well. But we're hoping that it can really help us. We get that question a lot, right? What's the best use of this corridor, this parking lane, or this curb lane? And we're hoping that, by coordinating that effort with Denver Moves Everyone, we can try to have a better answer for what these corridors should be used for in the future. Is it a transit lane, a bike lane, or parking? And then as soon as we decide that it's parking, that's when we look to make sure that we have a nice balance of restrictions and whatnot.
I just want to point out that bus stops occur even in neighborhoods that don't have residential parking permits, right? Stating the obvious, but we say certain extents of the curb lane have certain uses that serve many people, and we carve it out and we designate it. Do you see that extending to loading areas, not just for a certain business, but sort of pick up and drop off spots and delivery spots pervasively throughout the city, even not coupled to residential parking permits?
Yeah, and I think you'll see it already. Loading, we put in, I would say the number, besides, I think loading is probably the number one thing that we talk about, honestly, throughout in the last couple of years. It's prior to 2020, it was a lot about Uber and Lyft and passenger loading, and then post, through the pandemic, it was curbside access, so people could come and pick up and drop off, pick up food and things like that, and then just with the expansion of just the different types of loading that happens or deliveries that happen, we are really looking at how do we, create a pattern, if that makes sense, for a neighborhood. You can see that on South Broadway. There's a pretty good pattern of end of blocks for loading or 30-minute parking spaces for those short-term uses. So I think you'll see that more and more, and you probably are already seeing it more and more throughout the city. And then also alleys, we do want to emphasize that you can use alleys for loading and some of these services like this. But not everyone does it, and it doesn't make sense for all uses, but they're another avenue for that.
Okay, because this is a whole topic about trade-offs, let's go to John Ricky's question about trade-offs and who's being privileged.
I'm almost a bit confused as to why we're subsidizing parking in cars at all. I mean, it's 2022 and the planet is on fire. Why do some people get free parking and other people free parking? And why are we giving away free parking to people who own cars instead of putting in really anything else that doesn't pollute the air and providing beauty? And I don't get it. This is a once in a 35-year update, and we got a month fee, that seems small.
Yeah, and our priority really was just to try to recover costs initially. We talk about this internally, that this is the first step, that it won't be 35 years till we update this again. But we internally, we use the term base model, like this is your base model approach. What we'd like to make some enhancements in the future. And that's one of those things, potentially raising rates and making some other enhancements as well. But it's sort of the first step in the right direction, if you will.
Also, so from a permit fee standpoint, per ordinance, we can only recover costs from a permit fee. So our meter rates are pay for use. It's a little bit different than what a permit fee is. And so I think that this is our first, like Scott said, this is our first attempt. The thing that we don't want to do is have to talk about this constantly. We want to continue to update this as things change and as everything evolves on our transportation system. Similarly to our meter rates and citation rates, we don't want to have a big conversation around it every single time. We want to make incremental changes throughout so that it makes sense for our transportation system moving forward. So this is the beginning. It was a way too long time for this not to have been happening. So just trying to move it forward now.
There's a couple of questions that get at whether there is parking required off-street or existing off-street versus what this would do for on-street. Nica, you've got one aspect of that question.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to know if there's any plans to reduce or remove minimum parking requirements, specifically for mixed-use zones in areas where we would want to encourage transit usage and where we would expect a higher density of pedestrians to be walking.
Yeah, so this process just deals with the on-street parking supply. We have received that question in the past, but it doesn't consider any off-street parking changes through this process.
So that's more of a zoning question, but we have this sort of combined public policy question of we're driving up the cost of housing and things by requiring so much off-street parking, and we have a limited amount of on-street space and struggles allocating it. So it'd be interesting to have kind of a zoomed out discussion of what's our intention? How do we, and as people say in 2022 with the planet on fire, how are we working both of these things in the same positive direction? Steve Harley has a few questions here, and I won't even try to summarize. Steve, they're really well stated. And you appear to be off mute, but we're not hearing you. Yeah, I'm sorry, Steve, we're not hearing you. I see you've gone on and off mute though.
Give him a minute. His microphone isn't working, so he's trying to get it hooked up.
I think I might have got it.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for your patience. So we're in Baker, and I helped with the formulation of the area parking plan in Baker, and it's a huge compromise, but I've followed it closely and I've learned a lot in the process and been following what's going on since. The first question is, we have an interesting situation. Baker's got a bunch of different parking impacts. One of them is an ebb and flow, which may not be what a lot of other areas have, but we have what some people call an entertainment district adjacent to us on Broadway, and it brings in people in very short periods, not always exactly synced up with the typical weekend evenings, but the ebb and flow is not really well controlled by the area parking plan and the 2-hour limits and the open areas for parking. And so I wonder if there's any way to get a hold of that other than realizing that having an entertainment district is not really a beneficial use of parts of our city. Second question, if you'll bear with me, is
what about students who, residents who don't have off-street parking, and there are quite a few in our area, who don't bother applying for the permits, and they just aggressively utilize the free parking zones, which are in general in Baker, some of the north-south streets close to Broadway. They basically park up all those zones, and they don't leave any of them for anyone who maybe someone shopping on Broadway who could use them. And they leave their cars there all day or for days on end. Is there a strategy for dealing with that? Maybe somehow forcing them, or if they are in the neighborhood, they may not use that zone. And then finally, there's an edge effect that we've been frankly complaining about since the beginning of our area parking plan, where people who are just barely outside the area parking plan are disproportionately affected if they have a need for street parking, in a way that people who are just inside are not. If they come home, they may find that because of the parking restrictions, the area that is not restricted is parked up, and they can't park anywhere near their home. Some of them maybe have kids and so forth. I don't necessarily think we need to cover every possible case, like people who just get inconvenienced by this, but sometimes people are really impacted day after day by being 1 or 2 houses away from the area that does have permits, and then not having any access to their parking for long periods of time. So those are my questions. Thank you for bearing with me.
Yeah, Steve, good questions. It's nice to see you. And I've jotted down some notes here. And so I think I can address all of your questions, but please let me know if I missed anything. So, Baker is a challenge. That was our first curbside access plan, was implemented in Baker in 2015, and then we modified it 2 years ago, so in 2020. When we came in 2020, we removed a lot of the permitted parking and implemented a lot more 2-hour parking, as you know, and that was our attempt at trying to balance it more with providing resident access in the neighborhood, but then providing patrons with the ability to park in the neighborhood as well. So it was our attempt at balancing the restrictions in that area to try to accommodate more users. Your comment about unrestricted parking and folks that don't have permits, so they really seek out that unrestricted parking. They know where to find it. And oftentimes I agree with you, and I've heard this from folks in Baker, that they're parking there for extended periods of time. I think to help with that, there's 2 things. One is some targeted enforcement in that area. If they're parking for days or weeks on end in the same space, let's notify right away enforcement. Let's see if they can concentrate on those unrestricted areas. And then in the future, if they don't qualify for a permit because their vehicle's not registered at their address, they'd be able to obtain a flex permit in the future. So then they could get a permit that would allow them to park in one of the permitted areas, leaving that unrestricted parking open for another user. And then your comment about the homes or the streets on the edges, that's always one of the most challenging aspects of creating one of these plans, is knowing when to stop. We can't carry that condition, that restriction, all the way to Lakewood. So at some point it has to stop. And so what we typically do is we implement it, and then we go out, we make observations, and we look at parking occupancy, and we see how the parking patterns have shifted based on the implementation of that plan. And then we make some adjustments and essentially just stretch the plan out a little bit more along those edges until we think we're managing it, appropriately. And I think that was it, Steve. Did I miss anything?
Okay, great. Well, we've arrived at 8 o'clock. We didn't quite get to all the questions. Thank you, Alyssa, for addressing several of them in the chat. There are some really interesting changes here, and I think 2 of them to highlight and to watch for as this rolls forward is moving from RPP just on your block to RPP in a broader area, so that the push and pull of who has how many off-street spaces and who's using them and how many cars they have can be kind of normalized over a broader area. That seems really positive. But then also, and I don't probably have the right words for this, but really looking at places where RPP has been used that's not needed. There are some places in the city where it really has privileged the homeowners to be the only ones using that space, even though they have garages and alley access and use it. And so you have the kind of bizarre situation where you go to those streets and the on-street parking is unused. Clearly, we're not sharing it so that it's highly maximized. So those are two areas I'm really looking for the benefit of this from. But thank you, Scott and Alyssa, and thank you to all those who were serving on your working group. And Scott did send the presentation along, so I'll try to get that out to everybody. And we've reached the end of our time tonight. Thanks for joining the INC Transportation Committee. We meet every other month. We actually have just about all our topics lined up for our next meeting, which includes Denver Moves Everybody, which is the strategic transportation plan update, prioritizing all the projects that are in all of our other plans, as well as several other items. I look forward to seeing you then.